format for the Garrod seminar series, in that we're today having a roundtable panel discussion. For those who don't know me, my name is Paul Lane. I'm the Jennifer Ward Oppenheimer Professor for the Deep History and Archaeology of Africa. And you can ask me afterwards what on earth all of that means, because I'm still struggling to find out myself. Just to let you know that we are recording this session, and we've had consent from all of our panelists as well, and I'm very grateful for that. Questions this time will be posed through the Q&A option that has been set up on the webinar, and we hope very much that there will be lots of questions, and we hope that we'll be able to have the time to address them all. I'm going to ask individual panelists just to talk for 5 to 10 minutes on their area of expertise, their experience, their perspectives, all relating to the teaching of African and diasporan history and archaeology in British schools, but also exploring some of the issues that might discourage Black and minority students from applying to Cambridge or to other universities to study either history or archaeology. Obviously, as I teach African archaeology, I feel that there's a lot to be learned about Africa's deep and rich archaeological pasts. And I would love to see many more British archaeologists of African ancestry engaged in this work, just as we work hard to try and get African students at MPhil and PhD levels into studying with us. But it is a challenge, and we do really want to hear from everybody who's got appropriate experience, if you like, what they think might be some of the impediments, what might be some of the barriers, the kinds of things that we ought to be taking on board and strategies that we ought to be adopting. So I won't rattle on any further, but I hope that's given you a broad sense of what we're hoping to do. And I'm going to ask our first panelist, Dr. Hira Gandolfi, who's in the Faculty of Education here at the University of Cambridge. And she works very much in the area of decolonizing curricula and pedagogy from the perspective of science studies. So Hira, please feel free to say a little bit more about yourself, and welcome, and thank you very, very much for joining us. And don't forget to unmute.
So can you hear me well? Perfect. Yes, so thank you, Paul, and thank you for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's interesting that when I got the invitation, I felt like, oh my God, I'm such an outsider because I'm a chemist by training. That's my identity. I'm a science teacher, chemistry teacher. And then I was thinking, okay, what can I tell you as historians and archaeologists that might be helpful? And then the answer was so easy, after thinking for a minute, because I do my work in decolonizing science through your work in history. And I cannot decolonize science and technology studies in any level, in secondary schools, science and technology studies in the academia, without the work of historians, sociologists, and philosophers of science, for instance. So actually going back to the type of work I actually do, it is all grounded in the work of historians and archaeologists. So I promise to share a little bit about my trajectory with you, and then the type of work I do and how I see history as a central part of decolonizing anything, really. So like I said, I am by training a chemistry teacher. I'm from Brazil. So I am from one of the colonies, not necessarily a British colony, but there is a very interesting relationship between the Portuguese colonial period in Brazil and the British history. And you probably know the slavery, it was a big part of the conception of Brazil as a country. And I used to teach chemistry, especially in secondary schools in Brazil. And when I was working as a teacher, I also did a part-time master's in the history of science applied to science education. And the reason why I decided to do that is very specific. I was teaching in a mining college. So I was teaching specific degrees, post-secondary school degrees, technical degrees around mining and mining technologies. So mining is a massive tradition in Brazil, not just from the colonial periods, but still nowadays. And as part of my development as a teacher in that specific context, I wanted to understand more, not just the chemistry background in the mining sector, but also the history of those companies and those traditions that my students were going to get involved with. So I got involved with studying mining technologies and mining traditions and geology and mineralogy in Brazil, and how that could be part of my teaching as a chemistry teacher. And that brought me for the first time in contact with the colonial ideas and the special Latin American school of the coloniality, and how we understand the development of our fields of chemistry, biology, history, geography, all the disciplines within the context of colonization in Latin America, how our universities were created, how knowledge was coming through the colonizers to that context, and how that happened, what happened really. So that got me into the mindset of decolonizing the colonial ideas around development and technologies in Latin America. And then I came to the UK 5 years ago to do my doctoral studies at the UCL Institute of Education, still on that idea of decolonizing science and technology applied to schools and education. And I think, like I mentioned at the beginning, the whole process of decolonizing our field as a former chemist and then as a science teacher, the whole process for me of going through this decolonizing process of my own knowledge about my own field was a historical process, not just historical for me as a trajectory, but it was a process of going to history to try and understand, in that case, in my master's, the mining history of Brazil. And it was about understanding my subject, my discipline, understanding chemistry from its history. And then became a project of trying to work with teachers here in England in the development of what we can call subject consciousness. So how much do we actually know about our own subjects in terms of their trajectories? And I think when you think about history and archaeology and in your education into the discipline, that might be a straightforward question and answer, because of course you are studying history in the higher education system, then of course you know the history of your subject, or you should. But that's not the case for science and technology studies, and that is a complication. Usually when you go through a degree in chemistry, history, or biology, you only learn the content, and you learn the skills in the lab, you learn the official content that you need to know, and you might learn how to do it, but do you really know how all that kind of knowledge developed through history and through sociological processes and philosophical processes into that curriculum we have in the academia? So then for me, this process of decolonizing science goes through decolonizing the subject of science and how we teach that subject in the higher education system. Because then our teachers, especially here in England, our teachers will have gone through that first higher education experience as a subject specialist teacher. They are a subject specialist. So my work with science teachers in London is a lot around what do you actually know about biology, about the history of biology. And I think Robin is probably going to talk about his work with the justice to history. And that's actually fascinating, because that's the discussions we have with the teachers. What is the justice to science? Are you actually portraying and creating honest images of science through your lessons? When you tell the story of Darwin, that's a massive thing in biology, right? So when you tell this story and you talk about the travels, and that's so fascinating and so romantic in the sense in the literary sense of traveling and getting in contact with other cultures and collecting samples and then creating this massive theory that is so important in the sciences. are you actually talking about how he got to travel? What was behind the support he had from the British government to travel to the colonies, to travel to all those countries? What is the soft power behind scientific and technological developments? Why are countries interested in developing mining in Brazil? And what is behind that exploitation of natural resources? So this idea of understanding how science and technology develop through those complex systems, through colonial enterprises. Most of what has been done in chemistry after the discoveries of the Americas and the travels to the Far East is indebted to this natural exploitation of the colony. So a big thing that we see when we do history of mining in Brazil, for instance, is understanding how the chemical knowledge from the Enlightenment in Europe arrived in the colonial context like Brazil with their own local geology and mineralogy, having to explore those specific new types of rocks and minerals. How do you adapt that knowledge? What is the local knowledge telling you about that? And then you have the added level, massive impact of slavery in the mining processes in Brazil. And then we see a lot of evidence that the slaves coming from Africa to Brazil brought a lot of new techniques and new knowledge about geology, because it was a very similar geology to the Brazilian one instead of similar to the European one. So how those connections happen are massively important to chemistry and to this subject. So are we being honest about that when we are teaching chemistry, biology, and all the very nice things that we can get out of science and technology in schools? So that's the kind of work I try to do with the teachers. And that's why I think history for me, it's a path to decolonizing. That's the kind of knowledge that I need about my specific field to actually start the process with those teachers. And just to give you a brief sense, because I like to talk too much, just to give a brief sense of how that work, how we've been doing that work. And I think what is the key, the central point of my experience in decolonizing the science curriculum in the UK is that it's not a one-off thing. You cannot only decolonize the evolution topic in the curriculum. It's not just talking about Darwin's travels and how that's related to colonizing processes and imperialism. It's not one topic, it's not October. It cannot be just decolonizing one part of that curriculum. It has to be a message across the curriculum, because if we want to change the images of our subjects, being that history, science, archaeology, if we want to show the students in the schools that there's much more to that, we need to be honest throughout the whole year. And then we need to do a comprehensive work. And to be honest, if you work in education innovation schools, we all know that if you want to change practice, if you want to change how things are done, it cannot be an add-on out of school hours only. It has to be something that is constant. So it involves building a community of practice. And I think that's where departments like yours need to work with schools and PGCE programs and teacher education programs, because there is an interest in changing, but how do you get access to the colonial knowledge is the central part of all this. So my question is, what can departments like the history of science department or a history department can do in the schools as a long-term process? I think our finding so far is that it has to be sustained, and it has to be through this kind of exchanges of knowledges between teachers and the knowledge production processes that you do in your departments. So this is, I think, a summary of what I've been doing.
Thank you so much, Hira, and I hope that after this you'll have all of our archaeological sciences sort of rushing to knock on your door, because you've raised some really interesting issues. And I think that it's something that we think about, the sort of more cultural history and culturally and anthropologically oriented lines of archaeology might seem a little bit easier for us to decolonize than the archaeological sciences, but clearly you've flagged up some really important issues that we also need to be thinking about. So thank you. So our next presenter this afternoon is Dr. Robin Whitburn, who's a lecturer in history education. And importantly, he's the co-director, as we've heard, of Justice to History, and also the co-author of Doing Justice to History, Transforming Black History in Secondary Schools. And I should have mentioned he's at UCL Institute of Education. So Robin, it's fantastic to have you. You've really been out in the coalface. So we very much look forward to what you have to say this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think it's brilliant that you've organized this in a way that we didn't start with the history educator. We started with the science educator. And I think I just want to really endorse what Hira has said in terms of decolonizing the curriculum. I think the first thing to say is that it has to be interdisciplinary. I always see my subject as interdisciplinary anyway, as history. But it was very good to hear that. I think the second thing I'd say, as well as decolonizing the curriculum needing to be interdisciplinary, I think it's also really important that when we think about decolonizing the curriculum, we don't neglect to look at decolonizing pedagogy at the same time. Because if you don't complement the decolonized curriculum with a decolonized pedagogy, you're not going to liberate knowledge, you're not going to liberate students. And so what I would mean by that would be that in decolonizing pedagogy, you share agency and voice with your students. So that in the field of history, that would mean that the students are engaged with sources. They are engaged with the process of deriving evidence and challenging and questioning evidence. And they need to do that through dialogue. So you need a dialogic pedagogy that gives voice and agency to young people. And perhaps that might go some way, Paul, to answering that question about how do we get more interest from our African and Asian students in these fields. It's not just about curriculum, it's also about pedagogy. But having said that, I'm going to concentrate on history curriculum now and just talk a bit more about that. It's often said, and has actually publicly been said very recently, that you can't change history. Of course, you can hide history, but you can actually change it as well. And there are two continents that have unfortunately suffered the changing of history over the past several hundred years, and that's Australia and Africa. And the history was changed, and it was deliberately changed as part of the imperial project of Western societies who wanted to take over these continents. And in both cases, they denied the history and civilizations of dark-skinned people going back millennia. Why Africa as our particular focus rather than Australia? The Australian case is fascinating and really interesting, and so I should say that my co-director is Abdul Mahmood of Justice to History, and one of our projects in the next couple of years is to construct a historical inquiry for schools based on the work of Bruce Pascoe in Dark Emu, and all of that archaeological and anthropological work being done in Australia is so critical and valuable. But most of the work that Abdul and I have done is on Africa. And I think the importance of Africa is that the size of the continent and the size of the diaspora and the integration of the diaspora with Western societies makes it really important that we do a far better job of presenting an authentic history of that continent to our young people in Britain and in other societies. And it's not just a matter of challenging the master narratives that Western societies created about Africa over the past hundreds of years, but also just interrupting the psyche of young people who, even before they come to the history classroom, have absorbed stereotypes about Africa. My godson is of Nigerian heritage, proud Nigerian heritage. His parents are graduates of British universities, and they've given him all the encouragement, all the knowledge about Africa. But even still, by the age of 6, he was telling us about Africa as a place where people lived in mud huts. Where had he got that from? He hadn't got it from his school. He hadn't got it from his parents. He'd got it from society generally, from the street, from things that you just pick up from the media. And so we really need to interrupt that psyche, and we need to challenge that directly in the work of schools. And how could we do that? Well, we could do that, as Hira was alluding to. We could do that with maybe a special month every year. But that doesn't present the history of Africa as on the same level as the powerful knowledge of Western societies. It's really important that we present our African narratives and stories in the same way that we do our British and American and European narratives. And so Abdul and I work on presenting, gathering this history into sequences of lessons that teachers can use in secondary schools. And quite recently, a group of teachers asked us to create an inquiry that would actually be the very first inquiry that students ever study in high school. So year 7, the first few weeks, they often do an inquiry that is about what is history, introducing the discipline to these young people of 11 and 12 years of age. And sometimes teachers will actually even construct kind of fictional mysteries that that students can engage in, like a murder mystery, to show what detectives do. Well, we decided to present them with a real life mystery, and I'm going to share my screen just to show you. This is the first thing that our students look at in year 7 in a history classroom. And we present them with a building. So we present them with this building, and we ask them to think about what kind of building does it look like? Where in the world do you think it is? And they come up with some very interesting ideas. They can pick up on some ideas about religion from the windows and things like this. But they often think that this is quite a modern building because it's very clearly sharply defined in its edges, and its material seems very solid. And then we tell them that, in fact, it's a church building in Lalibela in Ethiopia, built over 800 years ago. They're astonished at that. That interrupts the psyche. But then we show them this picture, which shows them it's the same area, and they pick up on the idea that this might have something to do with Christianity because it's got a cross, but they imagine that it's a kind of it's a plaque on the ground. And then here comes the reveal, where, of course, they're then shown that this is actually the top of the building that they saw at the beginning. And at this moment, they are absolutely blown away. And I have to say that I did this with my PGCE trainees a few weeks ago, and 20-something-year-olds are blown away by this. In fact, one of my trainees of Somali heritage, just on her Zoom lesson, she just screamed out, "Wow," on the Zoom call. So we then tell them about how it was carved out of rock, and the idea that they're now looking at Africa in a completely different way. And we go on to look at Christianity emerging in Africa in the 4th century in Axum. We look at some coins of King Azana and how his coinage changed. And all the work that the students are doing is based on, in fact, archaeological sources. And that's how they learn how to think about history as working with sources and deriving evidence about the past and the way that religion has been shaped in Africa. And then we go on to look at Islam and how, again, in the very same place in Axum, the followers of the prophet took refuge in the early 7th century, and how the Christian king of Axum gave them sanctuary and protected them. And then we move on to look at Mali, and the whole inquiry then is all about, it introduces chronology and maps and sources and historians. So they learn about what historians do, but they learn it through the lens of Africa. And then they go to 11th century England and they learn about the Normans, and they've learned about what sources and evidence do from an African context, and it's seamless like that. So that's my kind of little offering of what we do.
Robin, thank you, and music to my ears, I think. I've always felt that there's so much sort of rich material from the African continent that could be used generically in teaching archaeology, and slowly we are seeing in the more sort of introduction to archaeological theory and methods textbooks more and more African examples, but we certainly need a lot more than that. And your example of how we can use the richness of the evidence that is there to teach method, I think, is a really important one, and very much a key story to take away. So let's move now to somebody who really is at the coalface, Hannah Cusworth, who is head of history at Charter School East Dulwich. Hannah, thank you very much for being available, particularly in this week. And yeah, look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my school and our context, and then talk a bit about how we look at archaeology. It's not quite as exciting, sadly, as Robin's inquiry, and then maybe speak briefly, just very tentatively, about perhaps why my students maybe might not consider archaeology, I suppose, either as a degree or a career, and maybe what we could do together, both as schools and as the university departments, to kind of widen participation. So my school is in Southeast London in an area called East Dulwich, and our students are from a really, really diverse range of backgrounds. I think it's probably the most kind of genuinely comprehensive school that I have worked in the sense that it has students from a really broad range of ethnicities, but also it has both middle class and working class students. So it's a real sort of mix, and although East Dulwich is kind of known as being a pretty wealthy area, there's actually a relatively big mix of kind of socioeconomic backgrounds from students in the school. So some of our students are super familiar with archaeology. In fact, I've got one student in my Year 9 class who wants to be an archaeologist and has done, I think, since he's younger. His mums have encouraged him, I think, to do it. But for lots of our students, they don't really know very much about archaeology. Although, having said that, I think it is something they do talk about in primary school. So when we talk about archaeology in Year 7, our students have a pretty good definition, or like a basic understanding, I would say, about what archaeologists do. You know, they dig artifacts out of the ground. And so primary school teachers are doing us a real service, it seems, in kind of introducing their students to ideas around archaeology and what archaeologists do. In terms of what we do, I have to be honest, actually, when I was thinking about it and kind of making this list, it is genuinely mostly in Year 7 that we discuss archaeology with the students. And I think maybe that's because our curriculum goes chronologically. So we also 2 years ago decided if we wanted to move away from the kind of what is history unit that Robin decided. I think we definitely did have a murder mystery, and there was stuff about like pulling stuff out of bags and making students work out some sort of like crime or whatever. So we scrapped that, but we didn't quite go as interesting as Robin's inquiry, and we do something looking at the local area and looking at the variety of different stories we could tell about our local area through different sources. And a big feature of that is this bronze tablet that was excavated, I think, in the Victorian era, and it's from a Roman soldier who has been given it as part of their kind of being released from the Roman army and becoming a Roman citizen. And it was found very close to our school, and so the students just love that. They find that really fascinating. And we use it to hypothesize about kind of the diversity potentially of Roman Britain, and whether there was like a big Roman fort near our school, which gets the students really excited. And then later on in year 7, we do look at Roman Britain very briefly, and we look at Ivory Bangle Lady in quite some depth, and Beachy Head Lady in slightly less depth. And then students do look at Ivory Bangle Lady, and also before that they've looked at Cheddar Man. So we do quite a big, a couple of lessons on Cheddar Man, looking at how the team worked on like sequencing his DNA and what kind of claims they were able to make about him from that. And the students absolutely love that. I think partly because you get to do that kind of big reveal where you ask them to think about, well, what do they expect he's going to look like? And then you say, actually, the team worked out, you know, that he probably looks like this, and that really grabs students. Last year, for the first time, we then taught about Professor Susan Westhazen's work, The Emergence of the English, and this idea of kind of disrupting the kind of traditional view of Anglo-Saxon England, and the idea of it being like this kind of mass invasion, partly just because I thought it was such a fascinating piece of scholarship, and definitely using Robin's phrase, like disrupting the psyche, but also because it's quite a nice story in terms of how she carried out her inquiry, what she found, and then also a good example of kind of archaeology and how you can use archaeology in history. After that, it kind of, I suppose, tails with like how we use archaeology. It kind of tails off. We look at Mansa Musa in the beginning of year 8, and that's pretty textual at the moment, mostly using like translations of the Arabic sources. But I know there's a lot of really fascinating archaeology that we could also use. So perhaps we will try and fit some of that in next year. And then later on, we kind of use material culture around the empire at GCSE, looking at particular kind of items. And while lots of those items maybe are more like looted rather than dug up from as part of a kind of dig, I suppose it kind of helps maybe link into this idea of what archaeology is. So maybe I'll talk now about some of the reasons why I think our students potentially don't, I mean, this is very tentative because I've not spoken to them about it. Obviously, we have our very keen archaeologists, but I wonder if it's that until quite recently, maybe we weren't as explicit about archaeology in the history curriculum. It's also, I suppose, not a kind of established career path or even maybe degree in the same way that history is or law is, for example. I think very few of our students could probably imagine themselves as being an archaeologist or see that as like a potential career path. And maybe a big part of that is we haven't encouraged them, we haven't talked to them about it, we kind of haven't suggested it. And I wonder as well if lots of kind of parents would be quite skeptical of it as maybe a degree choice and then potentially as a career. But when I was in a former life, I worked at the student union in Oxford, and a lot of my work was encouraging students to apply to Oxford for students from non-traditional backgrounds. And a big thing we focused on was encouraging students to maybe consider the not so hugely oversubscribed courses. So instead of applying for medicine, thinking about going for maybe biomedical sciences, or instead of going for law, thinking about doing another course they could be quite passionate about and then thinking about a law conversion afterwards. And maybe that's something as well we can explore with our students, thinking about if they have a passion for archaeology, it doesn't necessarily then mean they can't go on and do something else afterwards. It just means that it's something they can really excel in for 3 years, and it doesn't tie them down to a career path. So I wonder if it's just in schools we don't think about it. We think about encouraging students to do history, but we wouldn't necessarily consider kind of encouraging them to do archaeology. I think maybe that's because also perhaps it does have, to some extent, like either an image problem, whether that's because people just don't really know about it, or they see it as kind of like very nerdy people like doing digs in kind of in like muddy pits. And I wonder if our students also couldn't see themselves being an archaeologist because they've never seen a Black archaeologist, they've never seen an archaeologist of colour. And that might be something as well that we could work together on, kind of publicising or showing more images of archaeologists of colour. And then we're very much hoping, we are starting soon the African Kingdoms paper for the for A-level. We're like a growing school, so we're opening our sixth form next year. And so I'd be really interested in hearing from people and working with your department on how we can bring African archaeology into that A-level, and how we can expose students, I suppose, to its kind of richness and its complexity and beauty through that course, because maybe that will be a way in which we can encourage students who are already kind of quite committed to doing history at a higher level to African archaeology.
Thank you, Hannah. That's really fantastic news. And there are lots of really important take-home points from there. And I very much hope that we can work with you and other schools on bringing the archaeology into the African Kingdoms A-level. I mean, Toby Green has done such an amazing piece of work in trying to get that together, and the teaching resources and so forth. But and unfortunately, Toby couldn't join us today, but he was very interested in. I hope we can sustain those kinds of conversations. But your point also about archaeology, and I think this is something that all of us who, whatever our specialism is, all of us who practice archaeology recognize is that there is such a breadth of sort of skills and experience gained from studying archaeology, from individual work to team work to science-based to quantitative to qualitative to humanities-based, all kinds of challenges of using different types of evidence. And it really should be much more widely promoted as a very good general degree that can lead into all sorts of other career paths. I'd never thought to say I would actually agree with anything that Margaret Thatcher had to say, but she actually did recognize that a long time ago. So fantastic. Okay, so we're now going to shift, and thank you, Hannah. We're now going to shift to studying African archaeology at Cambridge, but also to hear the perspective of someone who came from Africa, teaches archaeology in a university in Africa. It's fantastic to have you here, Chilma. For those who don't know Chilma, she is one of our PhD candidates, but she's also a lecturer in archaeology at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka. And Chilma, I think when you were here in the UK, you did a lot of outreach work for us. So we'd really want to hear your experiences of doing that, and maybe the contrast or the similarities also with teaching archaeology in Nigeria. So Chilma, fantastic to have you. Thank you.
Yes. Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so delighted to be here. So when I was in Cambridge, I was involved in lots of, public engagement outreaches with the postgraduate outreach scheme in Cambridge. I was also involved with the Cambridge Science Festival and the soapbox science, and I was really surprised when during one of my classes with students from secondary school between the ages of 14 to 16 years old. And I asked them, can somebody tell me what archaeology is all about? And surprisingly, in a class of 15 students, just one person knew what archaeology was all about. And I was like, some of them were giving me answers. Oh, archaeology is the study of rocks, or archaeology is the study of dinosaurs, but during that period of my outreach program, I had very good conversation and interaction with students, even primary school students. because in most of my outreach events, I had display of some of the materials that I retrieved from Nigeria, like potsherds, different decorated form of pottery. And most of the kids that came around to see these materials, they were quite excited and fascinated. And they were asking very leading questions. Oh, what was this used for? Where is Leja? Because my research area is in southeastern Nigeria, in Leja. So some of them were asking, where is Nigeria? What is this used for? Why are you interested in archaeology? What do you tend to gain from all of this? And I was able to, tell them what we do as an archaeologist, and the need for archaeology and history as well. And it was a very good experience and interaction for me. I also work with the Access Cambridge Archaeology, where we go to primary schools and have engaged the pupils in hands-on activities with most of the archaeological findings that we had. And it pleases my heart when I see these children, the children that we speak to, interacting so well, asking us very leading questions. Then back home in Nigeria, I've also conducted series, just maybe 2 or 3 during my excavation and survey in my research area. We had a dig where we invited secondary school students to come and to visit the excavation site, and we taught them what archaeology was all about. We allowed them to also ask questions and do some form of digging. And I could remember one of the students telling me that, oh, she never know what archaeology is all about, but now she's interested in studying archaeology, about 1 or 2 students. And in the area where I work in Leja, you can now see the positive impact of our research, because we interact with people, we invite them to our site, so they have an idea more than before of what archaeology is all about, the history of the people, because this is their history. I'm not from that area. So we talk to them about their history. I can remember telling them that this is the history of your ancestors. Your ancestors, they used this, they built this, although they are no longer here, they are dead, but this evidence remains. And so we are studying them to learn more of how they interacted when they were alive. So I was really pleased when I got the email to participate on this platform. And that also gave me the leverage of speaking to the school where my son goes to in Nigeria. I interacted with the head teacher, and I told her, because in that school they take subjects like computer science, French courses, but they don't do history. So 2 weeks ago, I've been in conversation with her, telling her that it's very, very important that we should incorporate history in their curriculum. That is very important. I know at first when I said that to her, she wasn't really interested. She said, why history? I said, why French? You are doing French, but you are not doing history. So I was able to tell her that we need to talk to our children about history. They need to understand where they are coming from, who they are. They need to know their identity. They need to know their social belonging. I'm still having that conversation with her to see if they will incorporate history in their curriculum. So basically that's what I've done in terms of public engagement, in terms of interacting with people and trying to bring archaeology, trying to bring my research to the limelight, trying to bring Nigeria, because a lot of people in Cambridge know very little about Nigeria, know very little about archaeology of Nigeria, archaeology of Africa. And I've been able, through this platform of the postgraduate outreach scheme, Cambridge Science Festival, the soapbox event, which was basically for women scientists, to showcase the science they do to the public. It was a very nice experience for me, standing on the box and speaking to a lot of people about my research. And I saw a lot of people, asking me questions, touching those materials, the pottery and some other materials that were on display. So basically, that's all I have to say with regards to what I've done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chioma. And I think you make a really important point that we shouldn't overlook, that even on the African continent, there is often a perception, the kind of same kind of perception that Robin's godson had of sort of Africa being backward and not having a deep history and not having technological achievements and so forth. And there's a very sad decline, I think, and it's not just in Nigeria, but across the continent, a sad decline in the teaching of history and the priority that national governments, a diminishing priority that national governments are giving to training history teachers and amongst them also archaeologists. So there's a lot of work also to be done in that respect on the continent. Yeah. Thank you, Chioma, for highlighting that. So we're going to move sideways now. And Christopher may be wondering why on earth he's here. And of course, it's all part of my cunning plan to convert him to archaeology. No, seriously. It's a delight to have Dr. Christopher Oswafo, who is a clinical research fellow in the Department of Clinical Neurosciences here in Cambridge, but also at Magdalen College. And I'm really interested to hear, if you like, a little bit of an outsider's perspective and take on this. So Christopher, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Bain, for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Honestly, I'm really excited to be here, and I've actually been taking notes since this all started. Just so many things that have been said already. So certainly, kind of the teaching of the history and archaeology of Africa at the Diaspora in schools in the UK and the curriculum first came to my attention. It was a council meeting with the local MP here in Cambridge back in June during the lockdown. But now, I'll probably just specifically focus on issues that I think deter Black British students from studying history and archaeology in general. Well, disclaimer, although I am Nigerian and I'm in the sciences, I do not claim to understand all the complex issues that influence the choices of Black students. However, I think I'm able to provide some insight by virtue of my background, my experience, and my current stay in Cambridge. So I'll just go straight into it. 3 issues that I've chosen to focus on because I think by addressing them may actually be active steps in the right direction. And I certainly believe this department has the resources to actually get all this done. So first of all, I think limited exposure of parents and their children is a very common issue, something that Chioma has already alluded to. I think many students of African or Caribbean background may have been encouraged or directed, or in some cases even coerced, by their parents into the sciences, either as a source of financial freedom or just downright lack of exposure to the huge possibilities within archaeology, both in the modern world and even from a historic standpoint. Those from very high achieving backgrounds sort of end up nudging their kids to specific career paths, while those from sort of more complex socioeconomic background, have to work multiple shifts to make ends meet, may not actually be able to sort of provide that direction or encourage their kids who may be genuinely interested in this field. So I think certainly events like the one Chioma did mention potentially can address this. And secondly as well, sort of at the same time, limited role models doesn't really help. In a sense, when you don't see people like you in a particular field, it tends to put a doubt in your mind whether this is the right place for you. And I think Hannah alluded to this as well. If you've not had the opportunity to meet the likes of David Olusoga, Patrick Vernon, who's a cultural historian, and Akala, the rapper, and I think these are sort of, great role models when discussing history. And if you've not sort of had the opportunity to share the same room with them, actually, you may not think in this direction. So I think it then becomes difficult for you to see yourself in that future. So I think having a chance to meet with these people can certainly shape someone's career in that direction. Then finally, limited understanding of the prospects of this specialty is sort of a major challenge in itself. I suppose from our own point of view, the odds of succeeding generally is in an already difficult and challenging environment, I suppose, for Blacks, inadvertently makes the decision for you, irrespective of what you want. So if we don't understand what the prospects are in relation to job security, opportunities, travel, public engagement, working with other universities, Robin has already alluded to this, then I think we're less likely to consider archaeology as a degree option. So, but of course, the good news is the fact that all these issues can actually be addressed. And I think they're well within the resources of this department. And of course, if these solutions are followed through, I think these would actually form the active steps that I think will attract a more diverse students. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm certainly looking forward to the plans that will come at the end of this panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Christopher. And I think there's some really key points, take-home points there as well, about issues of role models, issues of being clearer about what career opportunities might emerge out of studying archaeology, the opportunities for both specializing in it, but also for branching out from having had a grounding in archaeology as well. And I think you've highlighted, touched on a number of other really important sort of issues that are essentially structural issues that for those of us who come from a white British background perhaps don't always immediately think of as being challenges and reasons why people might be deterred either from studying our discipline or even following particular university sort of career paths or educational paths. So thank you, they're really important points there. So now we are going to hear from Merenisa Oren, who is a current sixth form student at Brampton Manor Academy. And Merenisa, I'm so delighted that you're here. It must feel a little bit like stepping into the lion's den. I hope it doesn't. I think we're very privileged to hear your perspective as being a sixth form student on these issues. So we look forward to hearing from you.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to this panel. I was particularly interested and intrigued by this panel due to the course I want to take at Cambridge, which is education, which will help me explain why students may not do as well as others, which may be due to their courses at history, for example, where they may be marginalized due to the British oriented history which they learn. Apart from that, I'm interested because I am an ethnic minority myself. I come from Bangladesh, and I would also have liked the opportunity to learn about my past. This is why I believe Black students should have the opportunity to learn about their past and not just about British history. And this would actually help them do better and be more engaged in their classes or their courses, which may explain why they may take archaeology, and which would increase the underrepresentedness in courses. I'm sorry if I make any mistakes because I don't take history myself, so I'm sorry if there are any mistakes. But about Africa, I think Africa is pretty underappreciated and often represented as a constant, as to constant droughts and poverty, and often associated with their primary sector jobs and slavery, for example. However, there has been a large history based on states, empires, civilization, innovation, ideas, which have been portrayed by archaeology, for example, the pyramids of Giza in Egypt. However, because of the structures back in the days where the material which wouldn't hold up easily, such as mud, thus they wouldn't be able to build structures which would hold up, and that this has limited archaeology, which because they would because they would like fall, like they wouldn't hold up basically, and they would fall. For example, like in Mali, where there was a huge mosque which was built, but it was demolished by like the natural disasters and the rain and everything, which has prevented the history and the archaeology of Africa to be found. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. For example, students the students have, for example, in Mali there was the Mansa Musa, he basically made up the history of, and he is a large part of the history of Africa. But therefore students like need to partake in archaeology to unravel the hidden parts which have been demolished, and they have been like limited, I guess, by the structures and the things that have not been discovered yet. And I feel like it is a myth that like Africa is a place without history just because it has been covered up by the Western colonization and like the slavery of Africa. Therefore, stating that Africa is a continent without a past has like damaging consequences for the future, and it has had damaging effects on students as they feel like they don't belong, as they are like in a ethnocentric curriculum, in a sense, if that makes sense. And like history allows people to have their self-respect and have their identity, which Black students are lacking, their personal connection, in a sense. And people can like be educated, if that makes sense, but they don't know their history. For example, if you're educated, if you have like a degree and everything, but you won't be able to tell me your history of your origin, of your background. And yeah, I from this TED Talk I heard that I think it was a scholar or a researcher, they went back to Nigeria and they were asking students about their history. They wouldn't be able to go beyond like slavery or like the normal general history of Africa. And it was like shocking because they knew about Henry VIII and British history and like colonization, but they wouldn't be able to feel attached to their own roots, which was kind of sad because they are like filled with knowledge of other parts of the world, but they're lacking in knowledge of their own country. So I believe that African history should be taught, since it's a part of world history, not just about the continent itself. And I don't know if this is right, but I'm sorry if I offend anyone, but I feel like because archaeology is like, it's not stated in schools, secondary schools, it's not given so much attention to. It's only undertaken by majority like middle class or maybe white people. So I feel like it should be stated more in state schools with from especially people from working class backgrounds, so they have more of a chance to like explore themselves and explore archaeology and the history of Black British people. And yeah, and I feel like archaeology goes back to it goes back millions of years if you look at artifacts and find evidence. However, history is just like, it just goes back 2,000 years, which is known as ancient history, but isn't ancient enough. So I feel like students, they should be given the chance to explore archaeology from like a younger age, for example, and as said by Robin, like have these programs put in place which can help them explore their potential and their history and the history which would help them maybe feel more engaged in class, maybe undertake archaeology and history, which would result in a less underrepresented course in the future. And that's all I got to say. I'm sorry if it didn't make sense at points.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Melanie. So that's really, so helpful and useful to have your voice in this whole discussion. And you hit on a whole number of really important things. The theme of deep history, what becomes ancient and so forth, when the very fact that all of us ultimately originate as a species on the African continent. The issues of the sort of the way in which dominant histories, if you like, silence the past of others, and in a country that aspires to be multicultural, that really is quite disgraceful. So thank you very much indeed. That was really spot on, and thanks for joining us. So we're now going to have our last panelist, and I'm very delighted to introduce Karina Ansell, who's the manager of the Honours Programme and history teacher at Newham Sixth Form College, and also her colleague, Alan Kuna, as well, who's been able to join us. So Karina and Alan, thank you very much. We very much like to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I think Alan's going first.
Okay, yeah, thank you. This has been such a fascinating discussion, range of speakers. And I think one of the key things I've taken away from today is the idea of people going on like their own academic and personal journeys, really sort of going back to their subjects and looking at them and thinking, well, what's the origins of some of this thought from science, from Darwin. When we're, the first speaker I heard there, her name, it's Hira, was so interesting when you're looking at science, and we see that sort of emerging, maybe modern science from the Enlightenment, and the way in which at the same time as those movements are going on, you've got that kind of contact with other people and the enslavement of other people. It doesn't happen just then, but the two things are really intertwined there. On a personal level, I'd just like to say something to an archaeologist. My mother's English, and my father was from Kerma, and in Sudan, and as a place, we've got as I joke, we've got the monuments in the back garden. When I was a small child, my dad used to say to me, and I'm talking about the 1960s, oh, we used to govern Egypt. And I would look at him as if he was crazy and just think, oh God, this is embarrassing. And then, over the last 2 to 3 decades, excavations have taken place, the reinterpretation of more colonial thinking about the archaeology of that part of Sudan, of Nubia, and they've actually completely exploded the myth that exploded the myth that Egypt governed everything for all of that period of time, that actually the kingdom of Kush was a major player in the politics there. And the finding of the black the statues of the black pharaohs in 2003 by Charles Bonnet, who I had the pleasure many years ago of meeting on top of one of the monuments in Kerma, was just like amazing, because it kind of just put into perspective the way that we need to look at the past again and reinterpret it and get away from that colonial lens. I'm just going to say one or two things though about what Karina and I have been doing over the last 4 or 5 years. The key thing that I want to talk about and introduce to this is the idea of working in partnership with people. And maybe in some ways, if the syllabus doesn't provide it, you have to find ways by doing extracurricular activities we work in a sixth form college. So I think we've got some more privilege in some ways than people who are working in schools where the syllabus is very crowded. We do have periods of time where we can say, okay, we're going to look at something different outside of the classroom. It's going to be after college, or, at the kind of Wednesday afternoon time when, electives and enrichment take place. And we've worked on, Karina's led on it, but I've assisted her in getting speakers in and project work on different subjects. And one of the key things we did a few years ago, we did a project called History, Memory and Identity. And by chance, talking about the memories of international brigaders who had fought in the Spanish Civil War, we got some knowledge of a Black Briton who had fought with the International Brigade, probably the only Black Briton who had fought with the International Brigade. His name was Charlie Hutchison. And that led us to a kind of a whole period of excavation by looking at various sites. We ended up contacting his family, and Charlie, it turned out, was the son of a Ghanaian man and a English woman, and he was born in 1918. But the story didn't end there because he had 4 siblings, and then it didn't end there because his father was a very notable Ghanaian merchant or Gold Coast merchant who had actually written a book about Gold Coast notables, which is a great source book of Gold Coast history at that period. So where we've gone on this kind of journey is looking at history, trying to introduce different ideas, different perspectives to our students, and you know, by, in a sense, moving away sometimes from the syllabus, we've able to enthuse them about the subject. And secondly, what we've sort of looking at as well is looking at our syllabus. So one of the things that you are allowed to do at GCSE history is actually look at a historic site. So because I teach the elective on Charles II and the Restoration, we've looked at various sites like the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, the Ham House site, and that's actually been that's one of the key things that students have found really exciting, you know, to actually look at a particular place rather than history being a long march of events, to actually look at something and look at its purpose, look at why it was built, look at why it was established, and what people did there. And that's been very interesting. So thank you for listening. You know, project work and partnerships have been a big part of our work. So over to Karina.
Thanks, Alan. So my perspective, I'm going to talk about from a personal perspective, but also from a teacher's perspective. Growing up in Romford in Essex, we didn't really have very much in terms of the way of exposure to Black history at all. So it was really only when I went to study history at Oxford University and also started meeting up with a wider range of people from different ethnicities that I really became engaged in the study of kind of more global history. And I think in terms of, as a teacher, the experiences that I've had, this chimes with something that Merenisa was talking about earlier. And thanks, Merenisa, you made some really interesting points there from a student perspective. One of the key things, I used to teach A-level archaeology, and I only taught for a couple of years because unfortunately we had really small class sizes. So we only had about 5 students who were taking it up in the group. And what Merenisa was saying about this kind of being perceived as kind of a white middle class subject, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Because we work in Newham Sixth Form College, which is a very diverse college in the East End of London. And so you can imagine there's lots of students from different ethnic groups. But the interesting thing about the archaeology course is it always tended to be white students. We had very few students from ethnic minorities who actually took archaeology as an A-level. And I think part of that is, again, I think Christopher was alluding to this, is that they didn't see it as necessarily a route that would allow them into a good career at the end of it. And a lot of parents probably hadn't heard of it before, so didn't really think that it was a good option for their son or daughter to be studying as a result of that. And I think that held a lot of people back from it. And I think the other problem with archaeology at A-level, when it was still on offer, was that it tended to be kind of associated with kind of white Europe. So a lot of the modules on there were things like kind of prehistoric Europe and religion and ritual. And that's obviously a really interesting and really worthwhile course of study. But in terms of African archaeology, I don't think students really got a chance to explore that side of things there. So I think those are kind of some of the issues in terms of the archaeology teaching. as a history teacher, my perspective in terms of teaching African history is that, I'm not sure if Alan mentioned it there, but we're actually going to be introducing the OCR Medieval African Kingdoms option next year as an A-level. So we're looking forward to kind of widening and diversifying kind of our own curriculum. And I think part of that was our experiences of teaching history. So I teach a module on 19th century American history. And one of the key things I was really interested in was, as a student myself, was looking at kind of how Black people shaped Reconstruction, how Black people played a really important role in terms of gaining their own freedom in the 1860s. And what I found really disappointing in the A-level curriculum was that we didn't really cover any of this. We spoke a lot about things that white politicians and presidents did in order to secure Black freedoms, but the idea of Black Reconstruction wasn't something that was really focused on. And I felt really strongly as a history teacher that Black people had been kind of left out of the narrative, and that they were kind of being treated as victims rather than agents of their own history. And I think that's very disempowering, particularly if you're a Black student, to kind of be hearing these kind of narratives and to be thinking, well, where is my voice? Where is the voice of kind of my people in this? And the second module that I specialise in is 17th century British history. And again, 17th century British history, you know, there's lots of connections with the outside world, but actually we don't really look at those things. We look at kind of political and economic revolutions within Britain, but in terms of the connections with the wider world, it's kind of a very insular course in some ways. And so part of what I wanted to do as well was to kind of explore other options as a teacher and say, yes, it is up to the government to kind of try and reform the education system, to try and make moves to diversify. But as a teacher, I can also start doing those things for myself and making some brave choices that maybe I might not be familiar with this period of study, but it's something as a teacher that I feel is useful and beneficial for my students. So we've also started to explore options which are related to the interconnection between Britain and other parts of the world, including Africa, before the period of formal empire. So kind of looking at the sense that, and trying to teach to students the fact that our histories are shared and they're valuable and they're interconnected, and the history of Africa, the history of Britain, the history of Europe, they shouldn't be studied in isolation from each other. They should be seen as kind of an interconnected whole. So students just don't think, I'm studying an isolated section of African history here. They're seeing those wider and broader connections. And so part of what we wanted to do with the New Vic African Studies Centre that we've just created was to actually start a network of kind of teacher training in which teachers would kind of share ideas and resources. I know myself as a teacher, I don't have a lot of background in terms of medieval African kingdoms or African archaeology, but it's something that I'm interested to learn, and I feel that's good for my students. But I'm also conscious that I would really benefit from having those kind of conversations with other teachers and developing our expertise together. So I'm really grateful to you, Paul, for inviting us and for giving us all the opportunity to be able to discuss those issues.
Karina and Alan, thank you both very, very much, and some really important observations. And I very much hope that we can, not just me, but my colleagues who teach medieval archaeology, archaeological science, and so forth, and sort of really begin a conversation with you, and hopefully also with you, Hannah, as well, about ways in which we can assist and help sort of both enable the teaching, but also sort of offer our ideas. As somebody who works on one of the things that I work on is the 19th century trade in elephant ivory. I'm very, very conscious of how there is this global interconnection, and the trade is, there are some really fantastic stories that can be told that help flip a kind of understanding of relations between the West and other parts of the world that are often seen as part of the global periphery. I mean, a case in point being the very first steam-powered cotton mill in the United States as part of that helps, you know, contribute to the US's sort of industrial revolution, was built in Salem, Massachusetts, precisely to produce a quality of cotton that African consumers wanted and preferred over that cotton that was being produced either in the Bradford mills or the homespun cotton that had previously been imported from India. You know, this is African consumers shaping, if you like, the direction of history and industry and economies on the other side of the world. And it's the kind of story, I think, that you know, our engagement with the global connections between continents that we can trace through archaeology, not just in the 19th century, but further back in time, is something that we really need to work on together. It's fantastic for you to raise those issues. And you, Alan, I think you brought up a really important point that sort of links in with very much a question that we have in the Q&A, which is practically, in a practical sense, how do you approach curricula like the GCSE and the A-level curricula, where, you know, as teachers, you are expected to teach particular subjects because that's what people are going to be examined on, and how do you find the space in a very busy term to bring in these other dimensions? And I'd love to hear from either Hannah or Karina or Alan particularly on that, and maybe Hira as well. I'm sure you have thought about this, and Robin.
This was something that I really experienced with our GCSE. So our sister school kind of set what we study for GCSE for us. We do the same as papers as them. And so we do a paper on the First World War, and the AQA First World War course is incredibly narrow and incredibly colonial. And it only really focuses on the experiences of white soldiers on a very small part, really, of the Western Front. And this was really, I really felt uncomfortable about it. I really didn't like the course, but also I had students saying to me, like, Miss, this is supposed to be a world war, when are we going to talk about, like, are there no black people literally at all? And they wanted to know about students. I have students obviously of Indian heritage, and they wanted to know about the contribution of soldiers of Indian heritage. And at first I was like, I cannot see how I can get this in. Like, it just doesn't seem possible. It doesn't seem relevant. It doesn't seem possible. And then I read World War by David Olusoga, and there's a fantastic history teacher in Bristol called Paula who used the stories within World War to actually allow students to think about how do those stories of those kind of forgotten soldiers, how do they actually reveal a lot to us about the Western Front, about the changes in machinery, the changes in military technology, the kind of experiences of those soldiers, and how the war kind of ebbed and flowed. And so the students are kind of learning the same content, but it's through the stories of I suppose what you might describe as like non-traditional individuals in history. But I think it's really about subject knowledge. Like, the more I read, especially the more I read of kind of non-traditional histories, the more I'm able to find ways to get those histories into very prescriptive, very white, very colonial exam specs. And so, yes, I think for people, I feel like it can be quite a slow process, and don't beat yourself up if you can't do it all at once. It's sometimes it is just reading as much as you can, and then potentially like little baby steps. And then when you have more freedom, like we did with the A-level, to really make a case for not doing the same as our sister school, but doing African kingdoms, doing civil rights in the US, then you're able to kind of push for those, and then that does give you more freedom. But sometimes that's not always possible, and sometimes you have to, just do a little bit at a time.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to come in on that?
Well, I'd like to, it's Alan here. I'd like Karina maybe to comment, because on something this year we've also begun to deliver classical civilization at GCSE. And I know from Karina and conversations with the other teacher who's delivering that, but one of the things that's been really interesting is that students from ethnic minorities, when it comes to kind of religion and rituals, they're the ones who are really on it. They really get it. And I'm so, well, like, you know, they're encouraged. I think Karina could say a little bit more about this. That, you know, we've got students from Nigerian, Ghanaian heritage, really all over the world. And some of them make the most fantastic contributions and give the most fantastic insights. Yeah, when you're studying this really archetypal European focused subject, you know, the classical civilization of the ancient Greek world. Karina, could you say something there?
Yeah, I think what Alan said is pretty much right. You know, we've got students, a number of African students in the class as well, who really kind of draw connections between the myths and stories that are told in ancient Greece and Rome, and linking that with their own cultures and religions and traditions. So I think that's kind of one of the keys for us as teachers, is to kind of work with students' existing knowledge and to kind of show where those links are and what its relevance is to them as well.
I've got a related question here, again, primarily directed towards Hannah, Karina and Alan, but how do you deal with, if you take your students to a historic building or an archaeological site and there is sort of really no presence of anybody other than people who are white, how do you deal with that, and how do your students respond to that, and what kind of advice would you offer them?
I think. Oh no, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please do, Hannah.
I was just going to say, I think it is again a thing about teacher subject knowledge. Is that actually it's so rare that even a place that you see as being, it's hard to imagine that there would be like a Black presence or a link to colonial history, or just like exclusively a place that was used by white people, and is that it's actually often like not the case. So looking at like the building's materials and where those materials have come from, like where the wood has come from, where the ivory has come from, if there's gold, where the gold has come from, like those things, you don't get gold in Britain, right? You don't, nor do you get like naturally occurring ivory, at least not to my knowledge. And so those materials come from Africa. It's often like, they might come from, I think like if you're talking about the kind of like stones that were crushed to create paints and what have you, often they come from Asia. And so portraits that seem very traditional and that seem to only show kind of white European royals actually have very deep connections to other parts of the world that our students may have like family who come from there. But it does put a massive burden on us as educators to do a huge amount of reading, and because often we weren't taught this stuff in our A level or in our degrees. And I think that schools, hopefully over time, or maybe we need to push for it more, to give teachers more time to develop their subject knowledge and give us more time to connect with universities, so that we can kind of upskill ourselves, right, to kind of make up for the fact that there was maybe a bit of a deficit in our own education previously.
Can I say something there as well, Paul?
Yeah, sure.
I think it's going back to also like what Hannah said there, and also like Robin, made the point about you've got to kind of I think we're talking about rethinking things, and even for ourselves, we have to, in some ways, decolonize our own minds. I mean, that's why I gave the anecdote about myself and my father. He was talking about this. I was just like, "What are you talking about?" Egypt must have governed Sudan, and he was just like, And then when these discoveries were made, and actually when I met the archaeologist Charles Bonnet, he just completely inverted the whole thing, and it sets you on a journey. That that's it. You've got to kind of add to it brick by brick, because we've got to change things. We have to change ourselves, and we have to change what's out there. And one of the things, you going to something like, let's say, the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. Well, it was all about, you know, seeing the stars and Britain navigating, because it had a growing empire. And those were the things that the students were, they could be fascinated. Students from all over the world, a lot of Italian students who were from Bengali origin actually were fascinated by the Royal Observatory, going there on a visit. They loved it, but they could also see it in this kind of wider picture that, you know, kind of those lines growing out there, the Greenwich Meridian, how Britain claimed almost time for itself. It starts here, ends, you know, one side of the line and ends on the other. It was just very interesting for them. And, you know, you can really weave in those themes. Obviously, it takes the particular historic site, but even for all students, they have to study good history, and it's about getting under what is there, getting under their perceptions and trying to find something that's real about it. And if you can get the right site, then you can really go off like a bomb. I mean, look, the stately homes of England were built on a lot on the money of either the East India Company or, you know, slavery. And those are the works that when we do visit those sites, we need to have to emphasize. I mean, it's a big debate at the moment in the National Trust, as I understand, you know, about where did the money come from? Are we going to actually really, in a sense, you know, like confront real history there? So I think that's what you've got to do. You've got to confront real history.
Thank you. Robin or Hira, would you like to comment there?
Perhaps one thing that COVID will have done is that it'll probably seal the fate of the school trip, at least for a few years. And maybe that gives us the opportunity to think, well, when we think about a visit to a site, it's going to be virtual, so it doesn't have to be local. The site of Lalibela, as I said, you know, that I showed you at the beginning, I mean, that's actually only one of 11 churches like that were dug out of the rock. So, I mean, a historic site study of Lalibela would be amazing. And the students would learn a lot about religion, a lot about history. And so we can also, another one that we use is Great Zimbabwe. So we look at the way in which Great Zimbabwe has been interpreted differently across the 20th century. And we've got, there's a really, I think it's still available on iPlayer, Sir Mortimer Wheeler, his 1950s program about Great Zimbabwe, and we compare his interaction at Great Zimbabwe with Henry Louis Gates, his more recent visit to Great Zimbabwe, and the way in which they talk differently about Africa and their interaction with the site and so on. So it's referring to what Christopher was saying earlier about that representation. I was going to say one of the greatest moments of that inquiry about Lalibela is a clip of Gus Casely-Hayford coming up to the ridge above the church and seeing it for the first time. And the students are so wrapped in the wonder of how he responds to the church. It's a terrific moment. And there he is, Ghanaian heritage, Black British historian, as a role model. And so it's a terrific clip. And these things are there. I think, like Hannah and everybody's been saying, it's about finding out what's there. And then, you know, using something like the work of Miranda Kaufman and Onyeka Nubia on Black people in 16th, 17th century Britain. Both Onyeka and Miranda have told us about stories on the South Bank, for instance. So if you're going and you're looking at the globe, you can find out about Reasonable Blackman, a black weaver in Southwark, and things like this. There's a lot more knowledge becoming available.
Actually, just to add to what Robin was saying, there's lots of really good software out there. So things like Google Maps, where you can actually go in and you can visit these sites. Students can label things up. They can see things from different perspectives. So there's a lot of group and project work and individual research that can be done using that kind of software as well.
Thank you. Excellent. We've got a few more questions coming in. I think this one probably I'm going to pass first to Chioma to address, and then but others can also chip in. So, Chioma, how might you encourage Africans in diaspora and also those in the local community? And I guess this is what you do in various, they say in various African countries, to engage more in their history, to put in that same effort that they use in learning foreign histories, to learn about theirs?
Okay. I think the basic thing to do to encourage students is for us to do more of public awareness, because a lot of people don't really know what archaeology is all about. Most people don't really know their history. So we started doing with my students, because I lecture at the University of Nigeria. So when we go for field work, when we take our student, our third year, fourth year students for field work in the villages, we make sure that we involve the community members in our excavation. We make sure we interact with them. We ask them questions. We have interviews. We tell them what we know about what has happened here. And we also tell them that it's very important, because here in Nigeria, most parents want their children to read law, to read medicine, So when you say, I want to study archaeology, you want to study archaeology. Why do you want to study archaeology? You want to study history. So we are trying to change that narrative to tell even the parents, the student, that these are very good courses that you can study and, and become somebody in life, because they believe that when you study history, you don't really have the opportunity of being, of getting very good, well-paying job, if I may say. So we have started doing that with our public engagement outreaches. Myself, when I did my excavation for my PhD in ledger, and my department at the University of Nigeria, during our excavation, we usually have our, we usually take the students to field work for 5 days, and we do survey, we do excavation, and during that period, we interact very, very, very well with the community members. We go to schools, we speak to the students, we explain to them what we do, and we encourage them to try and study, to try to choose archaeology, to try to choose history, when they want to go to the university. So that's basically. Then also, the social media is now, what everybody can, look into. So there are so many platforms like like Facebook. You see people, like I know a couple of things. They have blogs, so they reach out to people via Facebook, via Instagram. They show pictures, because even the secondary school students, they have Facebook accounts, they have Instagram accounts. So that's also another platform we chat to them. But the major platform is during our excavation and our survey in the rural areas, and wherever we go to, we sensitize people. We have conversation about archaeology, about history, and about the need for us to study ourselves, for us to study our history. So that's
Thank you very much. So we're getting a lot of questions now. I'm going to combine these two, because I think they sort of speak to the same issue, but from different perspectives. So we have a question here that until there is greater diversity in archaeology and history, how do we ensure the interpretation of the African continent artifacts through Anglo-centric lenses is producing knowledge which is authentic and genuine to indigenous lives? And a related question, I think, that ties in with this is, do you think we can reach a point when BEMA students in higher students in higher numbers would study British prehistory and nobody would bat an eyelid, or even contemporary archaeology in Britain? So there are issues there about how to, particularly diversifying the teaching body, if you like, in our universities. Who would like to step in on either of those questions?
I think,
I hope you can
could I say,
yeah, Alan, please.
Yeah, if I just say something about that first question about what it's really like, this is the process. Much of this work is actually already going on in universities. I was a student years ago studying African history and politics, a degree level and MA in the 1980s, and I went to Sudan and so on and so forth. So it's knowing it's there. It's actually what is going on in school. So it's there in the universities, but it's actually making that link. And this is really the direction of travel with the partnerships. It's untapping that knowledge and putting it in. And I will say too, though we've got archaeologists here rather than historians, when you're looking at one of the things that we've worked on, Karina and I have worked on with Toby, is we produced an article about this, which is a transition from college, school, sixth form to university, and what are the issues? Because, you know, like the history department at King's College was saying, well, you know, we're not getting the candidates, they don't seem to have the skills, the wider knowledge, and so on. And said, well, you've got to go back to the syllabuses that are being written. When you do that, the universities needed to have far more influence in what was being put in those exam board syllabuses. There are three main ones in England. And when you go to one of them, you'll go to the breadth of, say, OCR, which you've then got Toby involved in with the African kingdoms, Toby Green, and then you go to another syllabus like EdXL, and it's all the way it actually allowed you to make choices was by having no choice, which was just getting these really narrow, if you choose that, you must choose this. Yeah, you know, narrowing the palette down and then producing the books that went along with the syllabus. So this was where people really missed a trick way back in the, you know, in the 2010 to 2017 period, when it was announced that there were going to be syllabus changes. It really needed to get people in there then. What we've got to do now is try to drive to get that diversity in the syllabus, and maybe by voting with our feet and teaching OCR and the African Kingdoms unit and just saying, we are going to do this. Yeah, we are going to make a change. All we can do is do our changes, and then by networking and developing that group, really changing things. This is what we're doing today. We're beginning to examine, we're talking about the perspectives and saying we want to change. I've said enough.
That's great, thank you. Robin and Hira, as people who work in the field of education and curricular development and so forth, it'd be really good to hear your perspectives on Alan's point.
Hira, you want to go first?
You can go first, and I have some closing points that you might tackle that as well.
I mean, I was going to go back really to Hira's initial point about interdisciplinarity. I think we're talking about wanting more students to do our subject and so forth, and to do this particular history. I think we need to, maybe one of the things we need to be is a lot clearer about why we think our subject is important and its purposes, and that we need to have this broader view. I think that's the great thing that Hira brought us at the very beginning of the discussion, was to see the history that we're talking about within this global 21st century world. And, you know, what is the history that matters to the 21st century? And that I think is an exercise that it would be well for history educators, historians, archaeologists to actually do a little bit more of that. I mean, it would help if we weren't always on the back foot having to, you know, justify our position. I mean, it's almost like we're running to catch up all the time. We don't get that space to have a decent debate. It's been really nice to have that today. But I think that kind of sacred why question about what we're doing needs to keep being addressed.
Thank you. Hira.
And yeah, so if I might, I think it brings everything together, because I was thinking about what Hannah said about this idea of the monuments and the places, and the story is there, you know, is the way you look at those places, is the way you look at the subject in your curriculum. So we had the first question coming through about how do you do that in practice? And I'm of the opinion that it doesn't mean that we are talking about erasing things from the curriculum or replacing things in the curriculum. And we are not saying don't go to Greenwich. I love Greenwich because it tells me a lot about my Latin American background. There is a lot of Latin American history in that place as well. Is that visible? So we have this discussion in the colonial curriculum talks about making the invisible visible. So those stories are there. It's just how we tell them. And we can do that in science. It's not just in the history side, because again, going back to what Robin just said, what is the point of teaching science today? Is it about memorizing the stages of something in a biology lesson? Or is it about giving our students, for instance, the skills? And again, going back to the idea of what are the skills in history, what are the skills in science that might be helpful in a pandemic for our students to understand what's happening? It's broader than just memorizing some periodic tables and things like that. There's more to our subject. And I think it's about going back to the whys and the hows of our subject and being more honest about that, honest to ourselves, but also to our students. And I think that goes again with the idea of why is archaeology middle class? Why? What kinds of images of archaeologists are we teaching when we are in the classroom? I work a lot with philosophy students, and philosophy is also a very middle class subject. Why is that? There is a structural problem of having that subject as part of comprehensive schools curriculum as well. But there's something about how we portray these stories of our subjects and the images and the way we teach, in the way we select the topics, in the way we select the examples within those topics, that make that subject middle class in a way. So yeah, and Marilisa said some interesting things about middle class, and that there is a lot to this image of being a middle class profession in other subjects as well, that I feel it's down to the way we talk about them as teachers of those subjects.
Yeah, and there's a good question here in the chat, precisely on very much the those lines, and in fact asking advice from both Hira and Hannah and Marinisa and Alan and Karina. You know, what ways do you think we could make our work as archaeologists more meaningful in engaging with a much wider and more diverse British population? So a BIPOC, I think, is the acronym that's used in this example.
May I have the permission to speak?
Absolutely, yes.
In my opinion, I feel like because archaeology is seen like middle class, it's in the view or the perception of the students that they see it as posh, classy, and like they really need to be smart to enter these courses or maybe go to private schools. And I feel like since it's not very diverse, students don't consider like archaeology or philosophy, as mentioned, as like their course or their subject. So I feel like the perception of those students need to be targeted and needs to be changed for the students to be able to like venture further into this subject or course. So that's my opinion.
And speaking from your own experience and those of your friends here, what that's you know, at a generic level, that's really fantastic advice. Have you got any practical tips for us, or practical suggestions, things that we might do?
I mean, I'm not really sure, but in my personal view, I take RS, which involves philosophy. I mean, I do get why people think it is very classy, because back in like the Enlightenment era, it was only like the middle class or the upper class who were taking these courses, and since we speak about them a lot, it is seen as very classy and posh. So I feel like it should be generalized more, and I do have a few friends who consider taking archaeology, and I have this friend who is really passionate about archaeology as well, and I feel like it's not really a thing that I'm not really sure, but it's just it's the preference of the person and the how they see the subject and the course. I'm not sure in like practical terms and like practical tips I could give, but I feel like it's just that we need to target the students' like perception and the view towards the courses.
Laurie, would you care to say anything about some of our outreach and our sort of, excavations and things like that we try to run in normal years? But,
Sure. I mean, we have an incredibly broad undergraduate course in archaeology at Cambridge, and I think that is actually can be a hindrance to us. Okay, so how do you define what is archaeology? Well, it differs from the course, and it differs within our own course. You can come and focus on learning ancient languages from day one, or you can go the other end of the spectrum and be interested in ancient DNA, human evolution and adaptation. So I think we have an issue of reconceptualizing, I'm making up words now, but defining what the subject is. I've actually worked quite a lot with Brampton Manor Academy, where Merenissa attends, but we do try and run events. Of course, in the last 6 months, they've been virtual events to raise awareness that the course A, exists, and B, can be attractive to people to students who are interested in the hard sciences. You want to do biology, you can do that, biological anthropology. Are you interested in the humanities side of things? Well, my gosh, we've got the theory, we've got the languages, we've got, Babylonian poetry, wonderful. By running events that, in person or online, that tie that all in together, or raise awareness individually, and working through the colleges at Cambridge. And it's been a fascinating evening, and I really look forward to working with individual schools to help develop resources, but also to work with you in ways to figure out ways to try and change the conception, not just for our university, but for our discipline at all universities across the country. And I have to say this, we talk about making it more accessible to state school students. We do actually, our course, although it's a really small course, we have one of the highest percentages of state school students on it. We can always do better. And perhaps it's a communications issue or a profile issue. Hey, this can be a course for you. Maybe we're not communicating it as well as we could. We need. Yeah,
sorry, Laurie.
Please, yeah, I'm just wabbering on.
No, that's a really good point. I think that sometimes there's a perception when we look at archaeology that it's about kind of like discovering royalty in car parks, or, kind of this kind of grand thing that we're investigating. But actually, if we look at what archaeology tells us, it speaks to a huge range of people from different backgrounds and all kinds of issues. So you'll be looking at things like sex, death, prejudice, power, all of those kind of really important things that speak to anybody, regardless of your kind of ethnicity or background. And it's those kind of themes that we need to kind of be tapping into. And I think that would really appeal to our students.
Or even very modern day topics, climate change, health, pandemics, social inequality. All of those, are being researched today by members of our department.
I think that we're pretty much out of time. There is a last question here. So I'm just going to ask those of you who are actually teaching history this last question, and a quick response. So how does the lack or limitation of written sources influence teaching history? In other words, are ancient civilizations with limited indigenous vernacular written histories more difficult to cover in your teaching? Any of you care to jump in and offer a perspective on that?
I think it's more difficult as a history teacher because you're so used to dealing with the written sources and the curriculum is so focused around that. So it does present challenges, but I think once you get used to that and you develop kind of a core set of skills. So for example, when I was teaching Islamic history, looking at the 7th and 8th centuries, and we were looking at archaeological sources and started to see what a huge wealth of information you could get about Islamic civilizations and kind of movements of people from different places, that actually you're kind of learning about how you approach history in a different way, that it's not actually a limitation, it's just about a different approach to the past, which is a really valuable thing for students to learn as well.
I mean, I think if you were to compare the challenge of getting students, high school students, to engage with I don't know, a text from the middle of the 19th century, to getting them to engage with the Church of St. George in Lalibela, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt which is easier to get them to engage with. It's just a matter of us as history educators, as Karina's saying, rethinking how we view a lesson, how we view how you work with knowledge, and that, you know, knowledge derives from sources. And students, the good thing for year 7 is that everyone can access a building. Everyone has seen a building, so everyone can get involved with what that building might involve. Whereas you give them a piece of text, not all the students in your room can engage with that text in the same way. So I think it's far more liberating to actually not be confined to written sources.
Can I just add something very briefly? I think that goes with the idea of decolonizing methodologies as well, which is very powerful when you're talking about decolonizing. Because if I think back about the indigenous communities in Brazil, we don't have that kind of written sources anyway. Does that mean I cannot do anything about that? And there's so many powerful buildings and places like that. And this is about decolonizing the methodology of history in a way. So why are we always thinking about the written sources? And not that it's just that, but we tend to go with those first, right? And why is that more powerful than other sources? And trying to see that as a positive thing, like having those other resources for you, right?
Like, I think, I don't know, I might be completely misquoting him, but I don't know if it's Hugh Trevor Roper or another historian who says something about, oh, there's no kind of real history of Africa because there's no written sources. And I think you're right, it's about the privileging of the written word over the material record, and we have to change our thinking about that. So that's a really good point.
And I think that might be the key for the archaeology side, because that's where archaeology can help us a lot, right?
Yeah. Can I just add something there? I mean, a few years ago now, Karina and I taught the Islamic history unit, and I had a Hungarian student in the group who said, there is no history in this part of the world. Why are we doing this? So I said, okay, let's take that comment, look at why you're saying it. We started talking about her background, the way that history was taught in her country, and Hungary's difficult relationship with the Ottoman Empire and so on. And then we started looking at also a whole range of sources and different historians. And after about 2 or 3 weeks, she had, about 6 lessons, she just said to me, said to the group, actually, I was wrong. And this was actually to a group of actually Muslim students as well, mainly Muslim students. She said, I was wrong, there is history here. I just wasn't able to see it. But, studying these things has really helped me change the perceptions. Yeah. And it's kind of like going back to those points that Robin was making. What is the purpose of history, if not to get to some forms of maybe like, accuracy, truth, but also in order to do that, we need to, as a country, we need to see ourselves as part of a world rather than this kind of idea of Britain being exceptional or Europe being exceptional, but seeing this as part of a round where, as you said, you go to Greenwich and you see that as being something that is connected to the world, and that's the purpose of it in the first place. Yeah. So it's the way you approach it and your own knowledge and your own thinking, really, as history educators. You're not going to find it in a book. You're not going to find one book that tells you this is how it's done. You're just going to have to be, committed professionals who want to educate themselves and change the ideas.
I think that's an excellent last comment to end on. Thank you, Alan. And I mean, we could go on and continue this discussion for hours. I mean, it's a fascinating one, and it's opening up all sorts of other lines of thought in my own mind. But I'm sure you've got your lives to get on with. I know lots of other people who are here. We still have a number of participants who've stayed the extra half hour, etc. I'd like to thank just everybody who's been on this panel, Meronisa in particular, because I think that, you know, it takes an enormous amount of courage, I would have thought, to join this, and you had some really fantastic observations to make. And whilst we probably are not going to convince you to become an archaeologist, I do wish you every success with your sixth form studies and your future career. But to the rest of you also, it's really been a very inspiring evening. And I hope, as I said before, and I think I've said to several of you via email, this isn't going to be the last point. We're not just going to leave it here. We'll reflect a little bit, but I hope that we can set up a small sort of working group to continue talking about these things. And also, I very much hope that we will see you know, opportunities for us to engage with the schools and other groups as well, and provide our insights and, you know, open up this discussion. And as Alan had and Robin had both sort of said, you know, just start saying, look, we've got to do it this way. So on that point, thank you all very, very much indeed for your contributions, to all the participants, for all the people who sent in questions as well. Thank you, and good evening to you all. And thank you, Laurie, for all of the technical support and making sure this ran smoothly. So goodbye, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Paul.